What if the Soviet Union was a monarchy? The Soviet Union famously murdered former Tsar of Russia Nicholas II and his family. The Soviets then established a dictatorship of the proletariat. Many other communist countries would depose if not kill their former monarch, with the only exception being Communist Grenada, which kept Elizabeth II as its queen. But what if that didn't happen? What if the Soviet Union was a monarchy? I split this video in two. In the first one, the Soviets keep the Romanovs as monarchs, and in the second one, the House of Dzhigashvili, or better known as the House of Stalin, rules Russia. In this timeline, when the Bolsheviks under Yakov Yarotsky enter the Apache house in Yekaterinburg, they don't kill him, but offer him the crown. When the Union of the Soviet Socialist Kingdoms, or USSK, was created, Lenin was in charge, but Nicholas II was the head of state. Lenin would still die in 1924, and Nicholas II helps Nikolai Bukharin instead of the radical Stalin or Jewish Trotsky. Unlike Stalin, Bukharin wouldn't start a 5-year program or forceful collectivization. Instead, the early Soviet Union would be influenced by socialist capitalism, like China under Deng Xiaoping. Like China, the economy of the Soviet Union would rise massively, and it is possible that the Soviet Union keep this model, seeing how effective it is. Like under Stalin, industrialization would begin, but unlike Stalin, he would be less brutal, which is a legacy of the Civil War. Mongolia would also be a monarchy communist dictatorship, with the first secretary also being the regent for the 9th Jepsen Dambakututu. On 17 July 1939, Nicholas II dies, but his son died of hemophilia in the 1920s. His brother died a few years before him, and his son died in a car crash, and his cousin dies a few months ago. And so his first cousin, once removed Grand Duke Vladimir Kirillovich, becomes emperor, as Vladimir III. In 1939, the Soviet Union and Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and Paris in Poland. The Soviet Union then annexes Karjala Sala, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bessarabia, and northern Bukovina. In 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union as part of Operation Barbarossa. They still lose in Moscow and invade the south. In this timeline, modern-day Volgograd isn't named after the General Secretary of the USSK but keeps the name Tsaristine, and so Germany doesn't focus on the city and pushes towards the Caspian Sea and the Caucasus Mountains. But the Germany fail at their goals because the Soviets destroyed their oil fields in that area, and Baku still being under Soviet rule, as they can supply that region through Iran. With German forces undersupplied and winter kicking in, the Soviet Union pushed the Germans out of the Caucasus. With Germany not being crushed in Tsaristine, the Soviet advance is slowed, but that disadvantage is balanced out with the fact that here Bukharin doesn't purge the army. In 1945, the Soviets win the Battle of Berlin, and soon later the war ends in Europe, followed by East Asia. Just like in Mongolia, the Soviet Union establishes communist monarchies in North Korea and in Eastern Europe. Yeon rules over North Korea, Wilhelm III becomes king of the Prussia, Friedrich Christian I becomes king of Poland, Rupert I rules over Bohemia, Otto I rules over Hungary, and Mihai I and Simeon II remain monarchs of Bulgaria and Romania. Since Albania, Yugoslavia, or China are independent, they could become socialist republics, or also have a monarch. Those would be Zogu I for Albania, Kadar II for Yugoslavia, and Pai for China. A Cold War would still emerge with the capitalist West following the Truman Doctrine. The Korean War and Chinese Civil War still happen with the same outcome. The Soviets still support communist groups, but for those countries with no royal family, a republican government takes over. The Berlin Crisis and Cuban Missile Crisis would also take place. In 1968, Bukharin dies and Leonid Brezhnev becomes general secretary, and he would oversee a time of stagnation and the Soviet-Afghan War. Following the death of Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes general secretary. His policies of perestroika and glasnost would see the dissolution of the USSK. Vladimir III would have to abdicate the throne on December 26, 1991, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and would die a few months later on April 21, 1992. Gorbachev, on the other hand, would die in 2022, and following the Yeltsin era, Putin would still become leader of Russia. In this timeline bearing some internal policies by the Soviet Union under Bukharin instead of Stalin, nothing would change at all. In the second timeline, Nicholas II and his family still get executed on July 16, 1918, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is formed on December 30, 1922. But in this timeline, following the death of Lenin, Joseph Stalin puts on a crown and declares himself to be the Tsar of the Russian Empire as Joseph I. Nonetheless, he still keeps the socialist policies of Lenin, and Russia is still communist. With this move, he also took away the autonomy of Russia, Ukraine, Byelorussia, and Transcaucasia. Russia under Joseph I would be still like our own, with which I mean forceful collectivization and industrialization, famine in the south, purges, you name it. The Russian Empire still signs the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and partitions Poland with Germany and annexes Sala, Karyala, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bessarabia, and northern Bukovina. In 1941, Germany invades Russia, but this was the last step in Joseph's legitimization. He always lacked that, but with him being the protector of Russia against the Germanic horde, he finally got a legitimation. Furthermore, nobody would oppose him in Russia's darkest hour. Germany would still lose in Moscow and Stalingrad, and would be pushed back. In 1945, the Russians win the Battle of Berlin. Soon later, the war in Europe ends, followed by East Asia. The Russian Empire could either restore monarchies in Eastern Europe, establish communist dictatorships, or maybe make generals like Zhukov or Khrushchev kings of Eastern European kingdoms. In 1953, Stalin still dies. His heir died in 1943, and so his grandson Yevgeny becomes emperor as Yevgeny I at the age of 17. Him being young and vulnerable meant that a regency led by his aunt Svetlana Stalina is in charge until he is ready to rule in order for Russia not to collapse. Nonetheless, people in Eastern Europe see their chance and rebel against Soviet rule, which would however be crushed by Soviet tanks. In 1957, when Yevgeny I became 21, the regency ended, and he became absolute emperor of all of Russia. His foreign policies would likely be like his grandfather, strongly against the West and aggressive. It is possible that this harder stand could cause the Cuban Missile Crisis to go hot and end humanity. If that didn't happen, he would surely still invade Afghanistan, and the war could rage on for a longer period. In terms of interior policies, those would likely be like the Stalin Bloc for the USSR, which is a political party created in 1999 by Yevgeny himself. He would be Stalinist, not reform Russia like Khrushchev or Gorbachev did, and even blend in some social nationalism and patriotism in it. The Cold War likely doesn't end and still rages on without Khrushchev's policies. At one point in the 2000s, the Russians would leave Afghanistan, having destroyed it even more. 9/11 could still happen, but in 2012 or 2016, and the war in Afghanistan wouldn't be over yet. But with Obama or Trump leading this war and not Bush, I doubt Iraq would be invaded, meaning that Saddam Hussein is still in charge of Iraq. On December 22, 2016, Yevgeny I dies and his son Jakau becomes emperor as Yaakov I. In this timeline, the Soviet Union still exists, but it is centralized and an absolute monarchy. The Cold War and war on Afghanistan aren't over, and the USA never experiences a time of being the only global superpower. While one timeline saw minor, mostly domestic changes, the other would see more change to our world, but even that one is mostly the same. If you liked the episode, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Goodbye.